Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. I'll be unveiling some Game Week 27 free hit drops in this video. I myself will probably not be going for a free hit, as if I make one free transfer this week and remove Jota from my team, I should be on a position where I have 11 players. I might not necessarily have 11 starters, but I'm not sure if it's worth really taking a hit on someone like Edouard, who's been really disappointing, but might still get a little bit of minutes in this specific match. And the priorities for me are to move away from Jota and go into Weghorst and Son, and probably Antonio will have to be the one who makes way, even though ideally Edouard is someone who also leaves. If I plan to play aggressively, I might go for a -8, but I don't think a free hit is necessary on the cards for me. The free hit is probably more aimed towards either people who have 2 free hits and would actually like to kind of gamble on the upside of this week, or people who have a lot of Liverpool, a lot of Arsenal players who definitely need to free hit just because they are so far down from having a starting 11. If I actually just talk about the draft templates that I have, I think I have a more differential draft that will actually come up at the end of the video, and we'll probably discuss some of the key matchups, because in my opinion this week most of us will have a triple city sort of flex with the free hit. But the considerations in terms of whether you stack on Southampton players, United players, and Tottenham players is definitely up for debate. I think triple Burnley is a must-do on a free hit. So you might disagree, but I still think that, unfortunately, with Cornet not really being an option for this free hit draft, I still think you have to kind of go for what should be hopefully 1 clean sheet's worth of 2 Burnley defenders in Nick Pope and either one of the kind of fullbacks or someone like Ben Mee this week. But just quickly explaining the bench, as I said, a lot of people have different team values this season. If you actually have much more team value than this is going to be the highest sort of team that I'll be debuting here. You could obviously go for an upgrade on someone like Mahrez, although I think Mahrez seems to be most likely to start just due to the rotation element of Man City, and he did come on late in the game for City versus Spurs. So I do think that Mahrez will actually start this week, and whereas with Sterling and Foden, you might not say that their position is as nailed. Kevin De Bruyne is someone who has consistently started since he's actually come back in form and with full fitness this season. So I would actually think that he's a quintessential part of this free hit draft, especially with this Everton team being quite leaky in defense, with also the loss of Luka Dean and also just the new manager coming in. In terms of the bench, though, it's going to be Ramsey, Johnson, and Marte. These are the cheapest options that will probably be playing this week. Ben Johnson might not necessarily be the sort of defender that you want to have. I think having a slightly better defender, if you can actually afford one, in your bench will be much more useful for you, just because I think most people should be at around 106 to 108 team value this season. So that can be easily something that can change. Ramsey, I think, is a perfect price point to be a bench sort of midfielder in a free hit, and should be essential on most drafts. And Amartey, similar logic to Ben Johnson there, but he has been consistently starting lately. If we actually go to the starting defense, though, I would suggest going for Roberts. Roberts has the best underlying stats from all Burnley players when it comes to kind of creating chances, and you'll see that through him leading on a per 90 basis for expected assists, especially with Lowton kind of being out of the side. Ben Mee, however, is going to be that sort of goal-scoring centre-back who has already scored 3 goals this season, but it just almost seems like that he's not going to necessarily score within the next 2 game weeks. That's going to come up to chance, but I think you're either going to be picking between someone like a Me or someone like a Roberts. This is almost like a Gabriel versus Tierney debate, but we just know that their ceiling is not as high as these 2 Arsenal players in the previous week. With Cancelo, I think he's really inarguable. I think some people might be thinking about going for a double Man City backline, and I think that could be justified, but we've still seen this Everton team be able to score sort of from nowhere, just because they have some technical players with a lot of pace too that can actually surprise some teams. And the kind of Merseyside derby this season, where Richarlison had scored, or Gray had scored rather, is a very good example of that, where they still have the quality of players, in my opinion, to actually score. Cancelo for me is non-negotiable. I just thought his performance versus Spurs was fantastic, and I still think this Everton team won't necessarily set itself up to park the bus. I think when you were watching the sort of Lampard sides and the way they played versus Chelsea, with his Chelsea team, he was still very open, whereas some managers still to this day play very defensively versus City, even with top teams. With Roberts, as I said, that's kind of up for debate. Livramento, I suppose, is going to be the most controversial defender that we'll actually see this week. For me, I think he has his position secure for the Southampton team, just because his last week's performance was so good. But there is an element of rotation that could maybe ask you to change Livramento, and I think Livramento can be changed for Diogo Dalot. I am not going to suggest really going for Diogo Dalot. I think Livramento is a little bit more interesting. I also think that this Southampton team has improved quite a bit as of late. And I think there's a chance of him both getting offensive returns and also defensive returns. So that's the kind of logic I have there. I think Dallo is around that sort of price tier, one of the better options to actually replace Livermore with if you have a little bit more money and are not so confident in Southampton. But I think this is a great match to, or game week rather, to go for at least two Southampton players just because they have such a great matchup. Son Heung-min and Kane, for me, are non-negotiables in attack. Kulusevski is definitely a third Spurs player that you can consider, but I'll probably just reference that Kulusevski's position in the team is a little bit of a weird one where I think definitely Conte does prefer him towards Lucas Moura. But there are times where you might see him playing a little bit more out wide as a right wing back. And we saw that in the second half of the game versus Tottenham, even though that didn't really stop him from getting potentially 2 assists in the second half versus Man City, where he was a part of the disallowed goal and then also the final goal where Kane scored from a header. Kulusevski is interesting, but I just think there could be a little bit of rotation there too. I'm not exactly sure what his fitness is like because it did take him at least a week or two to get into the Spurs side. And I feel that Conte did start him in the previous match just because he had played so well versus Man City. But there could be an element of rotation there, whereas I don't think I'm so confident about rotation. Son and Kane are players who are pretty much destined to start each game, so you don't really have those issues there. Fernandes, once again, is a player who I wouldn't say is necessarily non-negotiable just because some other midfielders within Man United have stepped up as of late. But he still is leading effectively in the two major stat categories when you actually look at combined expected goals and assists. And the way that translates into points, I think Fernandes is still the absolute best option on a game-to-game basis for United. Even in the Champions League, we saw him get an assist for Elanga. And while someone like Sancho is kind of surging in form, I would still say that Fernandes makes a lot more sense unless you're trying to kind of budget cut this team and you might not have the same sort of value to be able to afford this sort of team. Or if you'd like to actually make some changes, such as go for someone like a Sterling and De Bruyne combination. I will actually suggest going for Mahrez and De Bruyne. The reason why I say that is because Mahrez was the one who sort of was the odd man out in the previous match versus Spurs. He was the one on the bench. And I think similar to how Man City often rotate in this stage of the season, I really do expect for Mahrez to be coming onto the pitch as he was that sort of sub and should be destined to start. Whereas Kevin De Bruyne is that option in City who I think, as long as he's relatively fit, Pep will see him as someone who deserves to start each game. It's similar to Bernardo Silva this season, but we have that sort of effect where KDB does somewhat take players like Gundogan or Bernardo Silva a little bit out of the game from just pure goal scoring and finding these sort of pockets of space higher up in the field. So I think that Kevin De Bruyne is going to be that player that you pick. You could also opt for going for a double City defense, but I would say Everton is just a bit of a weird one, I think, where their team is quite top heavy in terms of technical attacking talent, not so much defense, and I think you should prey on the fact that their defense should be quite weak versus the City team. With the forwards, I would actually go for Weghorst, and Weghorst will be someone who actually will discuss a little bit in terms of the captaincy sort of debate. I think personally he is the best captain this week, just because of the element of his height and how weak Crystal Palace and Leicester have been in set pieces this season. Burnley should also be one of those teams where I think they're absolutely deadly from the set piece, and you kind of are gambling on Weghorst to do well. He's one of the tallest strikers that I think we've seen in the league in the last few years. And his record in the Bundesliga is something that we shouldn't really laugh at. His performance in the previous week was a bit of a weird one where obviously that wasn't like a classic target man performance. I actually thought he was extremely clinical. And instead of playing like the archetype that people expect of him as a very tall, lanky player, I thought he took the ball very well in his stride and actually managed to kind of fire a crack at goal from range quite well. So there is the added element of Weghorst being a little bit more than he presents, I would say, and just being a little bit more technical than people give him credit for. So I think Weghorst is definitely an interesting option. We've also seen that Crystal Palace and Leicester, even though I would say that they might be favoured to actually beat Burnley, that they have been relatively open, and a lot of the games that they've played this season, we've seen that both teams have scored. So these defenses are not really strangers to conceding, and that's why I think Weghorst is a fantastic option. The thing with Leeds, though, is that they do present both Kane and Son as very, very good captaincy options. I might even be tempted to say that Son is a little bit more interesting as an option. Even though I think Leeds are capable of giving penalties, and we saw that in the Liverpool match, I would say I'm sort of reminded by the kind of poker that Sung Heung-min scored, I think roughly 2 years ago, where he was able to kind of, or a year ago rather, where he was able to prey on a very open Leeds team. And this Leeds team are very feast or famine, and they've still continued in this manner in the second half of the season. I think that even though we have the Spurs team who seemingly are incapable of breaking down teams that park the bus. Leeds are clearly not a team in the bottom half that try to do that. And similar to Everton, I think they will try to play on the front foot as much as possible because that simply is their philosophy, more so than Everton for sure. And this is a perfect game for Son to be a captain. Even over Kane, just because he's able to run off his man. And with Leeds sort of man marking structure, I do think this leaves a little bit more of space for Son to actually explore compared to the traditional defense that he's actually pit up against. Going to the forwards and the last option in Broja, I would say that Broja is interesting this week just because you have the option here of going for someone like a James Ward-Prowse in the midfield, and that's a present option. He is someone who you could consider if you would like to maybe arguably go for an upgrade over Broja, just because he also has the added element of being able to take set pieces, and that could be the gamble that you go for. I would still argue that Broja, even though he seems like a very cheap option, has vastly outperformed the sort of status as a cheap option. And for me, he is just as good an option as James Ward-Prowse would be in this sort of unique individual game where hopefully he's able to take control of his chances and score within the first 80th minutes, because we do actually often see that the Broja does get subbed off quite early just because fitness has been a little bit of a recurring issue this season, and this is one of his sort of first elite full seasons, and the minutes have definitely been in doubt just over the course of the year. I would actually say that Broja makes a lot more sense for me. Even if I had a little bit more money, I'd still keep him as the option. And I'd rather play a 3-4-3 if the fifth option is to actually go for a Southampton player. You could also opt to go for someone like Kulusevski, as I mentioned, from Spurs, or even go for someone like Elanga from United, who I will be featuring in a second draft. But moving forwards, let's go to the second draft. So the second draft that I'll be actually looking at here does include James Ward-Prowse, and this is sort of just giving the variation that I was talking about. So in my preferred draft, I would actually say Broja is quite interesting, and I think I still find him more interesting than James Ward-Prowse. But if you think that, let's say, this Norwich team is more prone to giving away set pieces such as a penalty, or even James Ward-Prowse being able to score from a free kick position, and also, if you wanted a little bit of a differential from other teams, will be Field and Fernandes. If you wanted to kind of budget cut a little bit more, then I think Sancho is a fantastic option to pair him up with. And those are the two variations that I really suggest. With the Man City players, I really wouldn't suggest changing too much about them. I think maybe you could actually go down to Foden in price, just because Foden is a little bit more of a player who presents the underlying stats without the penalties and the set pieces. But if Mahrez gets to start the game, I struggle to see how you can take penalties out of the argument. Ultimately, the City side is probably one of the best in drawing penalties. Whoever is playing within the kind of leading front three, I would say Sterling clearly is the best penalty drawer, and maybe that does affect Mahrez a little bit. But Mahrez still looked quite interesting as a super sub versus Spurs, and yeah, I just think he's quite an interesting option versus an Everton team who are also missing Luka Dean in that left back position. In terms of Sancho, I would say he's actually been on the uptrend when it comes to underlying stats. I would still say that Bruno Fernandes is that sort of main man, but you will see that Bruno also drops deeper sometimes, but he is still providing a plentitude of assists. Sancho is someone who creatively finds himself within the sort of final third quite often, and I think has been much more creative than someone like a Rashford this season. And that's going to be one of those X factors where we've seen Sancho score at various points in the season. And I think with the assists that he's been racking up lately and the goals too, kind of on that uptrend, he could be that differential this week if you'd like to stray away from Fernandes for whatever reason. The third and final three-hit draft that I'd actually like to unveil is actually focused more around Man United players. And once again, as I mentioned from the outset, you could also opt to go for Diogo Dalot if you're really confident in Triple United this week. We've seen this Watford team, I would say, honestly, be a step below most teams in the Premier League from a defensive point of view. And regardless of whether or not Roy Hodgson is a defense manager, which he clearly is, I think he's able to always provide stability to teams. This Watford team, in my opinion, is extremely poor from defense, and I think you could definitely go and opt for three United players. That, of course, is going to be extremely expensive, and we know that the jump from Sancho to someone like a Fernandes is extremely expensive. So depending on what kind of budget you have, I think Elanga is actually a fantastic option. The main thing for him, of course, is rotation. However, I think even as a super sub recently, he's actually done extremely well. And he has looked like one of the more direct attacking players who's also shown very, very clinical finishing too. So I have a sort of slight feeling that Rashford might be dropped for this game versus Watford, and he could be given some arguable rest for Elanga to actually start a match. And I think Elanga does actually deserve the start. He's been playing extremely well, as I mentioned. The Champions League goal was a pleasure to watch. Once again, sort of created by Bruno, actually. So that's going to be a little bit of a toss-up where I think if you wanted to go towards a much more differential draft and opt for some upgrades on some players that we've discussed, such as Mahrez, you could go for Sterling as well. But I think, as I said, you could go for an option where you go for Mahrez instead of Sterling, and then actually go for Fernandes over Sancho. But I think, yeah, the X factor this week might be Elanga, just to prey on that Watford team. In terms of Leeds, as I said, they're another very leaky defense, but I just feel that the game is more suited towards Son and Kane, who are able to sort of prey individually on defenders quite a bit and kind of flex their individual skill. Kulusevski could be interesting as a third option, sort of in that Elanga price range. He's also similarly priced to James Ward-Prowse. But here is sort of a third and final differential option if you wanted to go for a 5-piece midfield that's relatively cheap. But that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching the video. Best of luck with your free hit drafts, and I'll see you guys on the live stream.